Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time it is where you are. I'm Dave Rice. I just thought that I would like to share a little bit of my testimony with you. Perhaps it will encourage you, or some of you, and perhaps it will help. I have always found strength in hearing the testimony of other people, and Lord knows I have a lot of people who follow me who, they like, perhaps you like what I say, perhaps sometimes you argue with what I say, and sometimes we don't agree exactly, but you follow me anyway because you learn things, and when you comment, I learn things. But today is the time to just share a little bit of the story of David. Not David in the Bible, David Rice, me. I was born into what they would today call white privilege. Both of my grandfathers were engineers. My father's father was a Harvard graduate with a master's degree in engineering. My mother's father was University of Illinois, and he was a civil engineer, and he worked all over the world. He built the Pan American Highway from Guatemala all the way down to the southern end of South America, working in Ecuador and Colombia and different places. He built bridges, he built railroads all over the world, in Africa, above the Arctic Circle in northern Canada. He worked all over. My grandfather Rice came to Florida in the very early days, in the 20s, right out of Harvard. He'd had one job up in Massachusetts. And he came down here to work in a place that was then called Kelsey City, which is now part of North Palm Beach, north of West Palm. And when he got down here, they were building Palm Beach. They were building all of those million-dollar mansions. Palm Beach was the growing thing for millionaires. And he discovered that he could build houses. And he was responsible as a contractor building more than 30 of the mansions for the super wealthy in Palm Beach on the island. And he got into tile. One family sent him all the way to Spain to remove a tile mural from a castle and bring it back and install it in their house. And once he did that, everybody wanted one. When he ran out of castles to tear down, he started making his own murals, hired himself a Cuban artist, and set up a little factory out of West Palm Beach. And being a 33rd degree Mason, he thought that it was a great business opportunity, and many of the huge mansions and even the big Episcopal church in Palm Beach have murals that they believe came out of Spain, but many of which were actually made in a farmer's field out of West Palm Beach. But since he used clay that was shipped in from Cuba, and since his artist was a Cuban, he had no problem calling it Spanish tile and Spanish murals. And so he grew quite wealthy. I grew up in my earliest years in that kind of privilege. I know what it is to be 8 years old and have grown adult people, servants and maids, saying, "Yes, Mr. David," "No, Mr. David," "Yes, sir, Mr. David." To an 8-year-old, adults, I know what that is. I have pictures of me dressed to kill in a suit and tie when I was no more than 7 or 8 years old. My mother was educated. She had a bachelor's degree and later went on to get a master's degree from what at the time was called Florida State University for Women, which became later, of course, Florida State University. And so she had an education. My father, like me, and perhaps I should call this testimony Confessions of a Bipolar Christian. My father was bipolar. He went through the Navy, he went through college, but he could never really succeed at everything because every time it got hard, he would run off and leave thinking he could start over again somewhere else. When I was 6, he left my mother. I had a younger sister and a younger brother, and he just left and disappeared. My grandparents continued to help, and my mother became a school teacher. So while we were not dirt poor, we were certainly not rich. We were somewhere between lower middle class and upper working class as I grew up. My father went on to go through 7 wives and many girlfriends, many jobs in many places, and he struggled all of his life. And that was difficult to watch him struggle and to be a part of that, because before Christmas every year, Dad would call and ask what we wanted for Christmas, and he never once sent anything. He would call somewhere in March or April and tell us that we could come and spend a couple of weeks with him in the summer, but by summer something would happen and he would be unavailable and we would not get to go up. So I had no relationship with my father. His dad, my grandfather, was one of those strange and confused people. Although he was a solid businessman and made a lot of money, he was, because you had to be, he was a part of the church. By the time I remember, he had been elected deacon so many times that they eventually made him, like some of the other older deacons, quote, lifetime deacon. And so he was a lifetime deacon in the big First Baptist Church in West Palm Beach, where Burt Reynolds and many other famous people would go to church when they were in town. It was a church for the rich and famous, and that's where I grew up. But I had a single mother, and in those days, single moms were very unusual. My mother had one girlfriend who also went to the church, who taught school along with her, and she was also a single mother, and those were probably out of 3,000 people in the church. Those were 2 of maybe 3 or 4, 5 at the most, single moms. It was a real stigma. And I grew up with the same problems my father had with bipolar, which meant that I would be ecstatic at times and really excited. And there would be stages in my life when I could do anything. And then there would be times when I would be depressed and I would run off and leave and try to start over again. When I was in school, it kept me from ever succeeding. I went to college, but I never graduated in the early days. I I would be above 50 years old before I ever earned a bachelor's degree. And that is a little difficult to explain, but I went in the military at 18 to get away from home. I went in the Army in the middle of the Vietnam War, and they sent me to Germany. And Germany was a great time and a great place, and I had a car and I drove all over Europe, and I had a good time. And when I came home, I was 23, and I started college, and I became a ministerial student at Palm Beach Atlantic College. And I went a couple of years. I was less than 25 years old when I was ordained as a Southern Baptist minister at First Baptist Church in West Palm Beach. And I was one proud dude. I really was. I was extremely proud. But school didn't work out, and I moved to Texas. And while I was in Texas, long story, I met a young lady at church, but I don't think she ever knew Jesus. But I met her, and she seemed to want to get married. I still say the only thing that we ever had in common was that both of us were getting up in years. We were all of 26 or 27, I was, and she was a couple of years younger. And we really wanted to get married. And other than that, we had almost nothing in common. And I married her, and we started a new life. And I joined the Navy. I'd spent 3 years in the Army, and now I joined the Navy in order to support her. And we moved to Jacksonville, and I was on the USS Talbot, and we went off about 3 or 4 months, actually, after we had been married. We hadn't been married very long at all, when the Navy sent me on a 7-month cruise to the Middle East. And that was exciting because I was in the Persian Gulf at the time that Iran was taken over by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the embassy was not taken till after I left the Persian Gulf, but they had shot a couple of Marines, and it was a bad and desperate situation. And when we came back 7 months later, I found out from several friends that my wife had had a long affair the whole time pretty much, and that she'd actually had a man living in our house during the time I was gone. And after that, we had no relationship. I mean, she would roll over at night and say, "Don't touch me." And we lived like that for 2 years. And then I just got so desperate that my life fell apart, and I ended up committing some crimes that we won't go into here. But I got in trouble, and I got arrested, and I spent some jail time. And while I was in jail, my wife left me and married her boss, and they moved to Texas. And that was a difficult time and situation. And when I got out, the Navy forgave everything, let me go back to work. And I got a girlfriend. And I went again to sea, this time just for a couple of weeks. And when I came back, I couldn't find my girlfriend. And I called her dad, who was a Baptist preacher, by the way. And he said, "Oh, you didn't know? She got married last week." And that set off my bipolar, and I went into a horrible depression. And I went down to a motel, and I checked in, and I wept, I cried. And then I got the idea that God was telling me to go start over again. that I could change my name and just start a whole new life somewhere else. And I got on the train and I rode all the way to San Diego, California from Jacksonville. And I was a mess. I cried the whole way to California. And then when I got off the train, everything changed. Everything changed. All of a sudden, the bipolar switched over, and I was on the top of the world. I had really very little money. I had nothing. I couldn't use my own ID. I was like, nothing, but I was feeling on top of the world. I can win anything. I can make it here. And I was walking. I went and got a little motel to stay for a few days, and I was walking through San Diego, and I ran into a guy dressed up like a Catholic priest. Now, I didn't even know anything about the Catholic Church at the time, except that I'd been told they were not nice people, and that Baptists didn't really want to have anything to do with Catholics. But other than that, I knew very little or nothing. And so I stopped and talked to him, and he was taking up collecting money for an orphanage in Mexico. And he told me, no, I'm not a priest, I'm a brother. And he said, we have a mission, and this is what we do, is we collect money for the orphanage in Tijuana. He said, why don't you come with me? And so I went with him and went back, and they had a group house in Chula Vista, and they had a guy who was running it. And it turns out it had very little to do with the Catholic Church, although the guy who ran it was a priest, and but he wasn't in really good standing with the Catholic Church, and he didn't really have a job except for raising money for this orphanage. And so they took me down to the Catholic store, and suddenly I was dressed up as a Catholic priest. I was just dressed up like a priest, had my black shirt and my little backwards collar, the little yoke, and I was out with a bucket on the side of the street collecting money for an orphanage in Tijuana. And the deal was I got a free place to sleep, and I got to use the kitchen, and I got to keep half of the money that I collected. Half of everything that got in my bucket was mine. And it turns out that because I was so high, and my spells were long, if I was depressed, I was depressed for a while usually. And if I was hyper, then I was hyper for a while. And I was hyper, and so I was really good. Now, I was living for free, and I was making good money. You'd be amazed how much money a guy dressed like a Catholic priest can collect for an orphanage just standing on the side of the road. Absolutely amazing how much money you can collect. And I was doing good. I bought half interest in a sailboat. I was just doing wonderful. And then one night, it just hit me. This is all wrong. This is all so very wrong. And I laid on my bed in that house, and I just wept. I just cried before the Lord. And over and over and over again, I prayed, Lord, whatever it takes to get me from what I am and where I am to what and where you want me to be, do it. That's still my prayer. Very seldom does a day go by when I don't pray that prayer honestly from the depths of my heart. Lord, whatever it takes to get me from what I am and where I am to what and where you want me to be, do it. That's just my prayer. And I prayed that night for the first time, and I just kept repeating it. I kept crying. And the next day I dressed up And they said, we're going out to the San Diego airport, and we're going to ask for money at the airport. Well, they'd never done this before. And when we showed up, we got all sorts of interest from the airport police. They were really interested. And they came over and they asked me for my name and my social security number. And I wouldn't have had to give it to them, but for some reason God was moving, and I gave them my real name and my real social security number. And they came back about 10 minutes later and led me away and shackled me to a chair. And they said, you're wanted by the state of Florida on a felony warrant, and the Navy wants you because you're on an unauthorized absence from the Navy, and we're going to take care of you. And they stuck me in the jail in San Diego, and they called Florida, and they called the Navy, and the Navy came out and talked to me and said, we'll deal with you later. The civilians get first shot. And so they stuck me in a van, and they drove me and a bunch of other people all the way across country back to Florida, back to Jacksonville, and put me in the jail in Jacksonville. And so here I am. But there was an interesting thing that happened, just to go back a minute. I was on my way out the door at this San Diego jail. I was handcuffed with a bunch of other guys going out to get in the van that would take us across the country. And one of the other prisoners, who I didn't even know, just a God thing, he looks at me. Now, you have to understand, this was like June, the month of June. And he looks at me and he says, don't worry. He says, you'll be out by Christmas. How did he know that? I don't know. But he looks at me, and clear as a bell, he looks me in the face and says, don't worry, you'll be out by Christmas. Now, I know God was speaking through him. And so when I got back to Florida, they told me that I couldn't be on probation anymore, that they were going to send me to the state penitentiary. And they did. They sent me down to South Florida, near where my family lived. And I ended up in the prison there. Now, I knew that I only had about 6 months to do, because that's all that was left on my sentence, but 6 months would have stuck me dead in the middle of January, not before Christmas. And so I went there, and when I got there, you may find this interesting, the first day they sent us around. It was a minimum security prison, so, just slept in a dorm with some other guys, and I got out the next morning, and they gave me a list of places that I had to go, and I had to go find all of these buildings and all of these people and get each of them to initial my paper that I'd been there, so that everybody knew that I knew my way around, and I had to ask directions. One of the first places I went was the chapel, and I met the chaplain, Chaplain Whitemire. He was a very great man. I'll take a minute to tell you about him. He had been a captain in the Green Beret in Vietnam, and that's pretty good qualifications for a man. He was a university graduate. He'd been an actual captain in the Green Beret, fighting all sorts of untold battles in the country of Vietnam. And when he got out, he got saved. And he became a Mennonite. Mennonites preach against war. They're pacifists. And so he had gone from captain in the Green Beret to Mennonite pastor. That's quite a change, if you ask me. But he asked me my story, and I told him my story. And I told him that, I'd been ordained as a young man, and that I'd just gotten totally away from God. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, I really need a chaplain's assistant, and you're my chaplain's assistant. Come back tomorrow morning, and you can start work as a chaplain's assistant. So I went around, and I saw everybody else and got my papers signed off. And the next morning, I went to the chapel, and I went in to talk to the chaplain, and he said, come, let me show you something. And he took me into this large room full of bookshelves. And he said, there are 3,000 books here in our Christian library here in the chapel, all donated. He said, but they're just on the shelf in whatever order they came in. He said, I'd like you to work on organizing those books and setting up a card catalog. And I said, okay, I can do that. I've been in libraries a long time. My mother was an English teacher. I could do that. I knew all about libraries. And he said, but what I really want you to do is, he said, I want you to read 2 Christian books of your choice. Pick any 2 Christian books you want off the shelves and read them every week and turn in a book report to me. And so for 6 months in the state penitentiary, I would spend an hour or so trying to organize books, and then I would sit down at my desk. Mind you, I had my own desk. I would sit down at my desk and read Christian books, and then I would write out a book report and give it to him. And this went on for 6 months. And we came up close to Christmas. And I remember the guy said, you'll get out by Christmas. But I was still scheduled to get out in the middle of January. But it seems like somebody had a good heart, and they decided that everybody that was going to get out through the end of January should get an early release and get out before Christmas. So about a week before Christmas, they let me out of prison. My time was served. I owed the government nothing more. There was no parole, no probation, nothing. I'm just free and clear. I'm out. So what do? I went home to where my mom and my stepdad lived, and first job I got was as a DJ at the Christian radio station. Now that was quite a job. I was a disc jockey playing records for minimum wage. That's what it paid, minimum wage, but you're sort of famous because a lot of people hear you. And I knew nothing about Southern Gospel, but the station was a Southern Gospel station, and so I read Southern Gospel magazines, and I got to where I could talk about the songs that I was playing, and it was sort of interesting. And I was still Baptist because I didn't know any better, I guess. And so I went to the Baptist church in Belglade, Florida, and there I am out in the middle of the glades on the shore of Lake Okeechobee, South Central Florida, and I'm just trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life. And so about, 2 or 3 weeks after I was there, I met this fella in the single adult department, and he invited me out to lunch because he was single and I was single, and so we went out to lunch. And he introduced himself and he said, hi, I'm Bill Townsend. He said, my father, you might know, Cam Townsend, he started Wycliffe Bible Translators. And I remember thinking, yeah, right, you're really Bill Townsend, Cam Townsend's son, and you're really living in Belglade, Florida, right? Well, it turns out he was telling the truth. He was A&P mechanic, which he learned through Wycliffe, and he was working in Belglade with the crop dusters, fixing and working on crop dusting aircraft. And So he says, I'm going for the summer to Peru. And I'm going to spend the whole summer, about 3 or 4 months in Peru, out in the jungle. And he said, I think you ought to go with me. I shared what I'm sharing with you now with him, and probably even more. And he says, I think you should go to Peru with me. So we hopped in his old pickup truck. And I had told him, look, I'm a Baptist. They give to the cooperative program. Okay? They give to the cooperative program. They don't give to independent individual missionaries. And besides that, I'm a convicted felon. Who is going to support me and pay for me to go off to Peru for the summer? He said, well, come with me. And we hopped in his pickup truck and we drove up to Waxhaw, where Wycliffe was headquartered. And we're in Waxhaw, North Carolina. And he takes me home to his mother's house. His dad, Cam Townsend, had been dead for a number of years. And his mother, who everybody called Aunt Elaine, was the grand old lady of Wycliffe. She was their, not anything important administratively, but she was the one who went out and spoke for them and raised money and traveled around and took pictures. And she was quite a lady. And she heard my story and what Bill said, and she said, well, you know what, if Bill thinks you should go, I think you should go. And so I remember sitting in her living room, and she picked up the phone, and she made exactly 2 phone calls and raised $6,000 to send me to Peru for the summer. And I went off to Peru, and we went out in the middle of the jungle to the Kandoshi tribe, their Shapara, and the man who was in charge there, the chief, his name is Tariri, Tariri. You can look him up, Tariri. You can find him on the web. And he was the first Christian convert in the jungle there, and quite a guy. They had taken him to New York in 1962 for the World's Fair, and he got to ride in a convertible, and he got to cut the ribbon and open the World's Fair, and quite a story there. Well, you know, a lot of things happened in Peru, except that I didn't speak Spanish, and I certainly didn't speak Shapara. And so I was sort of useless. I got to share a couple of times, and the sharing was sort of strange because somebody had to put it into Spanish. Bill would translate it into Spanish, and then one of the Indian fellows who spoke Spanish would translate it into Shapara, and questions came back the same way, and it was a little awkward. But we spent 4 months there. We were literally 10 days by boat from the nearest telephone. I mean, we were out there in the middle of nowhere. And that was an experience. And I came back and I was on fire for God. I was going to raise money and be a missionary. But it didn't work that way. And people still were not interested in supporting me. Well, I had a little cash, and I took my cash, and I took my old Datsun, and I drove to Mexico. And in Mexico, some strange things happened. I got to spend summer deep in the jungle down on the Guatemala border with an Indian tribe there. And then I got hired as an English teacher, and I spent 2 years teaching English in Mexico. Amazing thing. And when I came back to Florida, and my mom and stepdad were living over in Lehigh Acres near Fort Myers by that time, and I moved in with them. And so I'm just back in South Florida. And I'm driving around, and I keep hearing on the radio something for Manna Christian Missions, Manna Mission Institute. And they didn't say much about themselves except that they were training men and women to be missionaries, and that you could come talk to them. So I said no for a few days, but then I kept hearing it. They kept playing it over and over again on the Christian radio station. And so I went down and I met a fellow named Steve Crowther. And Steve, I went in, I told him my background. I told him that I was, a felon and all of this stuff and the whole story that I've told you. And when I was finished, I really sort of expected Steve to say, well, you really ought to go find a job at McDonald's or something. But he didn't. He said, can you start classes on Monday? And I said, I don't have any money. He said, well, you can pay us when you get the money. Don't worry about it. So I went through Manna Missions Institute, and I got an associate's degree in missions from them. And when we were graduating, the last day of class, and we're all there and graduating, and my parents are there and everything, my mom and stepdad, and we're dressed up. I think there were 7 or 8 of us that graduated. And our director, Peter Quinn, had been to Venezuela. He'd actually gone to Guyana, British Guyana, and they took him up into Venezuela, and he met a Guyanese pastor who had a church in Venezuela that was stuck at like 35 members. You have to understand, there were 180,000 people who spoke English, who were from Guyana, living in that part of Venezuela, because Guyana had gone communist. And nobody wants to stay in communism. And Venezuela at the time had not really experienced socialism, and they were still a wealthy country, certainly by comparison to Guyana. And so huge numbers of Guyanese had crossed the border and were living in Venezuela. There's 180,000 English-speaking people. There's one English church, and it can't grow above 35 members. And the pastor had asked Peter for help. And so Peter said, David, why don't you go to Venezuela? And he said, you're single. You can do it. And so I raised a little money, bought an airplane ticket, had a promised income of $200 a month, and I got on the plane and I flew to Venezuela. And man, it didn't take long to figure out why the church hadn't grown. They were 1930s Pentecostal. Pastor thought he had to be father to everybody in the church and control everybody's life, and his entire board was made up of his immediate family. And anyway, we made some changes, and I preached through Romans. And 6 years later, the church had grown to 500 people and planted 7 daughter churches, and we'd started a Bible college to train new pastors to take over the 7 churches that we'd planted. And God did that. That wasn't me, but God did that. I made some mistakes while I was there. I saw some horrible things. I saw a lady accept the Lord in our church, and next thing I know, she's in the hospital because her husband and her brother, who were Muslims, decided that her becoming a Christian was a bad thing, and they beat her within an inch of her life. I left that church, and we went out in the jungle and started preaching, pastoring a Spanish-speaking church out in the jungle. Lots of things happened. One of the first things that happened was I met my wife, Kathy, who was Guyanese, living there and working in a home church, and she was doing mission work in the neighborhood. And we got married all of 6 months after I got to Venezuela, and we have 2 children. When we got back from the mission field after about almost 10 years down there, we got back, and I took a position with a mission up in the middle part of Florida, and that didn't really work out. And I ended up driving a truck, and God gave us a huge house. It was amazing. It was 6 bedrooms, 2 baths, had a kitchen that wasn't really well equipped, but it was a big professional sized kitchen, had a formal dining room, had a living room and a parlor, a fireplace upstairs, a fireplace downstairs. It was a solid brick house. It was wonderful. And then God called me to a ministry over near Lakeland, and we left that house and moved into a 2-bedroom, 1-bath frame house in the middle of the ghetto. We had 2 small children, and I had prostitutes lining up in the evening on the sidewalk in front of my house, and this is the middle of the ghetto, and we would have a line of BMWs and Mercedes-Benz drive down our street picking up these girls from in front of our house. And it was a drug and alcohol ministry, and that's where the work was, so that's where we lived. And a lot of things have transpired since then, and God has built this ministry on Facebook for me. And you know, I always wanted to pastor a church, and I see pastors out there with 100 members, 200 members, 300 members, and I think, you know, I'd really like to do that, pastor a church where I've got real live people. But then I realized I probably haven't got the personality for that. And between friends and followers on Facebook, I've got about 8,000 people who are friends or follow me on Facebook, and 100 or more who pretty much regularly talk back and forth with me. And so God has given us a great ministry, a great home here to live in. Now I've got my own office that we just opened up in a spare bedroom in our little house here in Lehigh Acres. And God's been good. And I just wanted to share this with you to tell you that all that's happened to me. Oh, and I got Pentecostal a long time ago. I forgot to mention that. I left the Baptist church many, many years ago, and have been in both Assembly of God and Church of God. So I'm not over at the Baptist church anymore. But we're here and we're ministering, and God has done all of these things to me that I've talked to you about and more. And He has taken us up and down and in and through. But the whole time as I look back, God has been preparing me not only for what I'm doing now, but for what's coming, because we've got all kinds of problems. We're coming up on the tribulation. We're coming up on the most difficult time that mankind has ever seen. And as I look forward and see the kind of trouble that we're going into, I realize that God Almighty has spent 69 years through everything, good and bad, up and down. God has spent 69 years preparing me for this moment. And whatever's going on in your life, I want you to pray. And I want to ask you to please, don't ask God to do what you want Him to do. Don't figure out what you want done and ask God to do it. Just throw yourself at the foot of the cross. Throw yourself at Jesus' feet and say, Lord, here I am. Whatever you want me to be, wherever you want me to go, you do it. You make it happen. You prepare me. You use me to do what you want to do. You use me for your glory. And if God, it means a 6-bedroom, 2-bath, 2-story house with a walk-in attic, okay. If it means a 2-bedroom, 1-bath frame house in the ghetto with prostitutes lining up on the sidewalk in the evening in front of my house, Lord, it's okay. If you want to take me to the jungle of Peru, that's fine. You want me to drive a truck, that's fine. You want to send me to jail, you want to chop off my head, I don't care. No reservations, Lord. Whatever you want, you do. I'm available. Here am I, Lord. Send me. And I just plead with you to make that your prayer. And watch how God answers that prayer. God bless you. I've gone way too long on this thing. But if you stuck with me all the way to this point, you're a real trooper. God bless you. Let me know that you saw the last scene. Just put that in the comments, okay? God bless you. Have a great rest of the day.